This is the KNBC News Update with Warren and Olney.
Good evening. One skier has died tonight after being rescued earlier today from an avalanche at Mount Baldy. A boy was pulled from the Los Angeles River after being carried for 2 miles. We'll tell you what kind of weather to expect tomorrow on the news at 11 o'clock. We'll also tell you about 2 Iranian groups who had a violent clash at MacArthur Park. About 1,000 people were involved altogether. Fred Rogan with Sports Center 4, Cindy Allison and I have the news at 11.
Hello again, I'm Olney, and this is To The Point from Public Radio International, a daily look at the issues Americans care about most.
People always say, you know, don't you have opinions about things? And yes, I do have opinions about things, but I want to know what the other guy thinks and why. I mean, sometimes the answers to those questions are more interesting than the answer to a question that I already know and already have heard and agree with.
So what does this mean for the future? And is it still likely that Europe will split, that the euro itself might not survive?
The key, I find, is to listen, because sometimes they say things you don't expect, and the program just goes in a totally different way from what you had anticipated. That's when it's really fun.
You know, we've seen some spectacular things happen in recent weeks, and I think some more spectacular things are likely to happen, but all of them lead toward the conclusion that it's not going to happen cleanly or quickly.
Sometimes the more bizarre the commentary, the more interesting it is, because there's always a rationale behind it. Or at least usually there is.
Predatory pricing sounds evil, but is there anything illegal about it?
Because I really like it. I really enjoy doing it. I mean, it's fun.
Email us, share your thoughts on our comment page, kcrw.com/tothepoint. Join us on Facebook. I'm Warren Olney. Join us again for To The Point.
My mother said I would never be bald.
And I guess that's my cue to start. First of all,
Before you start, let me just say that I've been on the campus of Santa Monica College now for 25 years, and I love the campus of Santa Monica College. I come up from our borough, you know, we're in the basement of the Caton building. I can dodge the skateboarders now, I know how to do that. And I just want to say to all of you who work at the college, I know it's got a great faculty, to all of you who are in the, who are supporting the college, that it's a great place to be. And all you students, I'm really glad you're here. Particularly I heard about the extra credit, and congratulations.
And I have to start out by saying, you know, one of the best parts of this assignment was getting to meet Warren for the first time, and the conversations that we tried to limit it so that we didn't talk too much to one another, so that things would be kind of fresh. But it was such a wonderful experience getting to know you a bit and learning a little bit more about your history.
You're a pretty interesting guy yourself.
And so why don't we start off? And I know we're in a kind of non-linear time, but I'd like to work linearly here and kind of like take it back and let some of the audience learn some of the things about you that they may not know of. So let's take it all the way back in terms of where you started. Let's start. Where did you start?
In journalism?
In life.
In life. Well, I was born at Peralta Hospital in Oakland, California. I guess that probably the most significant thing that happened to me was I grew up in Berkeley. And my father got an appointment to the first Eisenhower administration. He was the Assistant Attorney General in charge of the criminal division. He had worked for Earl Warren all of his life almost. And so he was sort of the Earl Warren appointment into the Justice Department. And I moved from Berkeley to Washington, D.C. And I went to the Sidwell Friends School, which despite its name and despite the fact that it's where President Obama's kids go, when I went there, like the other private schools, even though it was Quaker school, it was a segregated school. While I was there in 1954, well, the first thing that happened was that the Democrats had been in charge for so long that all of my friends that I met, all my schoolmates, were the sons and daughters of Democrats. And so I asked my father, you know, why are you a Republican? And he said, son, the only thing that keeps me a Republican is the Democrat. I that time, the Democrats were the Southern Democrats, who have now become the Southern Republicans. There's been an extraordinary shift. In 1954, when Brown versus the Board of Education came down, we argued about it at the Friends meetings. You know, in a Friends school, you have a meeting, as they do in a Friends, at all Friends organizations. We got into big disputes as to whether Sidwell Friends would be, ought to be integrated or not. It took them finally 12 years to do it. They worked one step at a time, kindergarten, first grade, before they actually integrated. And that was a real lesson to me. My father quit the administration in 1956. He didn't work for the second term because he didn't think that they were enforcing the civil rights decisions of the Supreme Court, particularly Brown versus the Board of Education. There were all these Southern governors standing at schoolhouse doors, and they weren't sending in the National Guard or doing anything to enforce the law, which ultimately Kennedy did, although very reluctantly. So I saw that kind of action going on at a very early time in my career. I went to college. I was an English major. I had the faintest idea what I was going to do when I got out. I went to graduate school at Berkeley. I went to graduate school at Cornell. I still didn't know what I wanted to do. I got drafted. And that was 1963. There wasn't a lot of action going on at the time. And so I was stationed in Southern Virginia, and I got involved in an acting group. It's called the Southern Virginia Peninsula Players, or something like that. And a friend of mine suggested that I might want to do some moonlighting for the local newspaper. And I did. And I really had a lot of fun doing that, although I didn't get very good assignments. But it occurred to me when I got out, I've got to do something. So I'll go into journalism. I stumbled into journalism. I came back to California, and I was able to get a job at the Sacramento Bee. And the only assignment I ever got as a reporter at the Sacramento Bee that meant anything was when a lion escaped from a traveling circus. And I was set out to find the lion. I did not find the lion. Somebody else did that. But the McClatchys, who owned the paper, was now a big news service, but at the time they owned newspapers and radio stations up and down the San Joaquin Valley. Decided that they wanted to open a bureau at the state capitol for their television and radio stations. And no reporter at the Sacramento Bee, senior to me, would take the job because they were so contemptuous of television and radio. So they got down to me. And they found in my bio the fact that I had gone to the Army Information School, which is on David's Island in New York in Lanon Sound. Pardon me. And I think I spent an hour studying television there. And they said, you know all about television, don't you? Because you get this education. I went, yeah, absolutely, I know all of it. Because they were going to double my salary. So I went, that's how I got to be a reporter in the state capitol. And I don't know how much more you want me to rattle on.
At that point, did you recognize that as a career, as something that you would continue doing?
Yeah, I did. I think I did. My father had been in public service. I cared about it a lot. I didn't want to be a lawyer. I come from a family of lawyers. I'm wearing only the fourth. The others were lawyers. My sister's a lawyer. My brother-in-law's a lawyer. My uncle's a lawyer. Yeah, everybody's a lawyer. I didn't want to be one of those. So it seemed like a good thing to do. My father said it's a terrible idea. You never finish anything. You only get a little bit of something and then you go away and do something else. To which there's some truth. In any case, I stuck with it.
At that time, how much freedom did you have in terms of selection of stories? In terms of what would be covered?
When I was working in that job, and I was only in that job a very brief time, because what happened was that Ronald Reagan got elected. That was in 1965. I spent that year at the Bee. 1966, I was covering the gubernatorial election. And in 1967, Ronald Reagan got elected, and everybody had to have a bureau in Sacramento, so I got one in KROM, which is in San Francisco. That lasted a very short time. I won't go through this at great length. I spent some time in Washington, D.C. as a reporter, came back to Sacramento, and worked for Channel 2 in Los Angeles. That started in 1969, and that's the most freedom I ever had. I was 400 miles away from anybody who knew anything about where I was. There was a relatively low appetite for... They wanted to have stories from the Capitol. They wanted to know about Reagan. They wanted to know about the legislature. They was much more interested in it than there is now. We cared about it. And so there were a lot of sort of must-go stories that came out of there, although I embedded a lot of stories too. But then I had a lot of... That's what you do. I also had a lot of freedom. Northern California, no pun intended, is a gold mine of feature journalism. So I would go to towns because I liked the name. I went to Rough and Ready, California. And in Rough and Ready, they have a ladybug harvest. And there are ladybugs all over the ground, red ladybugs, and they pick them up and they put them in jars. And they bring down the temperature so that it suspends them. And then they sell the jars, and they'll send them to you, and you get the jars, you open the jar, you throw it out in the garden. The ladybugs wake up, and they eat the aphids, and then they fly away. So it was stuff like that, which was a lot of fun.
So at what point, or was there a point where you transitioned into covering more hard news?
Well, it was hard news out of Sacramento. I ultimately came down here, and at that time, I came down here in 1972, still working for Channel 2. At the time, it was called KNXT, and it was widely regarded as the best newsroom in the country in the ability to actually use the medium to tell a story, to put together the pictures and sound, and do it in an artful and powerful way. It's a very powerful medium if you know how to use it. And as I said, I've been in Washington. I had a lot of exciting opportunities there. I went to the Democratic National Convention in Chicago. I covered the riot in Washington when Martin Luther King was assassinated. Did a lot of other stuff there, particularly civil rights associated stories. But I didn't think that they knew how to do it, in the sense that they were competent with the medium. And one of the reasons I wanted to come back here was to work for Channel 2. And they did hour-long documentaries in the 60s. And one of the guys that I worked with, Joe Saltzman, who's now a very senior guy at the Annenberg School, was a producer there, and he did documentaries of such quality that he recently was approached by a guy from Yale who's doing a doctoral thesis on his documentaries. So they really were doing it right. And I was very lucky early on because the management was very permissive. And they had double the ratings of all the other stations in town combined between 6 and 7 for a show called The Big News. And so one of the stories I did, which I don't think anyone else can claim to have done, or it's like one I don't think anyone else can claim to have done, was this. There was a company called Union Home Loan, and they were running a lot of ads on our station. In fact, a lot of ads, a lot of commercials. And they had happy homeowners who had, taken out a second mortgage with Union Home Loan, and they were on camera being all happy about it. And a guy came to me and he asked me, "Have you ever seen one of the contracts that they write?" And I said, "No." And he showed me the fine print. And it turned out that it was full of balloon payments and all of these surprises with fees and all these kinds of things. And the classic case was a woman in San Rafael who had owned her house free and clear. She was a widow. She took out a rather small loan from Union Home Loan, and 5 years later, they owned the house. So it was that kind of thing. So somehow we found the names of the people who were in the Union Home Loan commercials on our station. And we went to their houses. And on camera, I showed them their contract. I said, I didn't take mine. I said, "Show me your contract." And I found the fine print and I read it to them. And they looked on in absolute horror. And I said, "Well, how do you feel about Union Home Loan now?" So the result of that was, we did a long series. It was a week-long series. I won't go into it at great length, but needless to say, they stopped advertising on Channel 2. I don't know of anyone who ever did that. And I did it with Joe Saltzman, this great producer, who helped me put it together. So it was very effectively done, and had some interesting stuff in it. I won't go into the details again, but I've never had an experience quite as liberating as that in the news business.
When you mentioned the civil rights era, in terms of, things that were going on at that time and the way you were raised and the anecdote about your dad. Did you get to cover any major stories dealing with civil rights that stand out to you?
Well, sure. Everybody did. I didn't go to Mississippi. I didn't go to to that and cover that because I was in the Army in 63, 64, and then I was in Sacramento in 65. I wasn't really, I wasn't covering stuff obviously in Washington. In Sacramento, the Civil Rights Revolution began to be seen. So, for example, there was a guy named Willie Brown. I don't know if you all are familiar with Willie Brown. But I had known Willie Brown earlier. I had a curious experience earlier in my life when I was a federal probation and parole officer in San Francisco. And he was representing indigent defendants in court, and I had seen him there. I knew him slightly. And when I went to Sacramento, I had this job for the Los Angeles station. He was the first African American ever to be appointed to be head of the Ways and Means Committee in the state capitol, a very important job. So I did the first network story on Willie Brown, if that's a civil rights story. I did that. Certainly in Los Angeles, there was civil rights all the time. When I first came down, Tom Bradley was running for mayor. He had just lost in a very racist campaign to the incumbent mayor, Sam Yorty. So I covered his campaign. It was a hallmark. He was the first mayor, black mayor of a major city. I think Walter Washington in Chicago might have been first, but it wasn't he. It was Tom Bradley. And Tom Bradley was very interesting because when I first came to Los Angeles, it seemed to me it was pretty Midwestern. It was pretty white. It didn't seem to me to be very diverse. Tom Bradley recognized how incredibly diverse it was even then. And so when he announced his staff after he had been elected, he not only named them in terms of their names, their ages, their genders, their former jobs, but also their religious orientation, their nation of origin, and things of that kind, and really made a point of the fact that he was running a world-class administration in a world-class city, which is not to say that Los Angeles has become a paragon of civil rights. I don't believe that it has. But the civil rights issues were always in your mind and always part of the news and always have been since I've been a reporter.
Mm-hmm. You seem to have had a fair amount of freedom in terms of the stories that you covered. What are the elements of a good story? What would drive you toward a story? What are the elements?
Well, the first element is something I'm interested in. The second is whether I think it's important enough to take the time that you have allotted to you to tell a story, to learn a story, put it on. So that's a high standard, I think, because you don't get that much time. So I tried to do stories that had social significance, political significance, that were challenging to public officials, informative to people who wanted to know how their government was being run and what the people that they had elected were actually doing. There's much more of that at that time than there is now. We used to go to the city council all the time. We go to the board of supervisors a lot, cover the meetings, and then, because we were, particularly when I started out, we were using film. And you had to wait for the film to be developed. And so there was time after you had shot the story to continue to do research into what was involved. And the stories were somewhat more sophisticated, more involved, more comprehensive, I think, than they have to do now. I mean, now they go out and do a live shot and they just got there and make the stories over and they talk about what happened before and then they go into another story. It's very different and that's why I quit, ultimately. But I had a lot of freedom. And as I said, you go to the city council, you'd see some councilman say something or take a position or whatever, and then you could go out and talk to people that were really affected by it, and and people would be affected in different ways, and try to balance it in the sense of showing how different people were affected differently, what the significance of a vote in the city council might be in terms of property values. The police, LAPD is always the best story in town, invariably, even though it's supposedly reformed. And that, of course, the civil rights and the police are hand in hand, 1%.
You started out in print, then transitioned into television. And the whole idea of visual images and the impact that had on storytelling and on what we call news today, comment a bit about that, about visual images?
Yeah, I will. I think that the visual image obviously is extraordinarily powerful. And if you use it right, as I think I learned how to do at Channel 2, it can have an impact. I think now, particularly on the cable channels, when you have a screen that's cluttered with stuff, you have a split screen and might be an obit, and so you have somebody over here who's talking, and you have the person who in fact is deceased over here, dancing or whatever it was that they did, not looking dead. And you have a crawl down at the bottom of the screen, you have something else going on the top, you have, what's the weather, who won the game, all this stuff on the screen at the same time. It seems to me that is a recipe for misunderstanding, for confusion. I think one of the reasons that people don't understand the government any better than they do and are willing to vote for somebody like the current president is that they don't really have any understanding of what's happening or what's going on, because to the extent that they are dependent on those visual images, they're not telling a coherent story.
I wanted to touch a little bit on news and credibility. When I was a kid coming up, Walter Cronkite was anything that came out of Walter Cronkite's mouth, you just believed. I mean, it was truth. I actually had a little personal experience with that as well. I was involved in when I was in college in a building takeover that became a national story. And I called my mother to let her know that I was okay in what we were doing. And my mother was crying, and she wouldn't believe anything that I told her. And I'm my mother's only son. I have sisters, and she always believed me. And my mother was, no, that can't be true. I heard it on the news. And I was so impacted by that because my mother believed someone she did not know over her own son only because it was on the news. And that led me to change my major and get involved in college radio, and that's how I got on the path to media.
And you'd always been truthful as a child. She had no reason to doubt you.
Edward R. Murrow, the dean, all of those credible journalists that we had at that time. As we move forward a little bit now, do we still have that same kind of credibility in terms of how the public responds to the news that they get in news journalists?
Well, we don't have these, czars of news anymore like we used to. But part of the reason is, of course, that the technology has changed to such an extent. And, Cronkite, Murrow, the people of that generation came out of World War II, and they were they were covering the war in Europe, the war in Japan, not Japan, but the war in the South Pacific. And it's interesting, and it'll be interesting to see what history has to say ultimately about how credible their reports were, because a lot of them wore uniforms and actually had Marine in the military so they could move around. And I think that as a result, there's a lot of things that went on that they probably didn't report. And the greatest generation may or may not have been as great as they portrayed it as being. They were very much a part of the war effort. They were part of what would now be called propaganda, I think. And I don't mean to say that in the sense that they lied about things, but I wonder how comprehensively they covered what was going on. By comparison, for example, what went on in Vietnam, Morley Safe from CBS did a story which was sort of crucial in the war in Vietnam when there was a village that was burning down, and he did a story with a American military commander who said we had to burn the village in order to save it. And I don't know how much, and that really did a lot to destroy confidence in the war effort. The reporters in World War II didn't do that. They didn't do anything they thought would destroy confidence in the war effort. At least I'm not aware that they did, and I don't think they wanted to. But they did gain a lot of credibility because, once again, nobody contradicted them. There was nobody in Congress who said, you know, wait a minute, our people are heroes, and you're reporting them as if they're just regular people. They reported them as heroes, and that's what everybody thought. And so there was no criticism of them. There was no attack. That all started in Vietnam, and also with Spiro Agnew, who was the vice president under Nixon, first vice president under Nixon, who attacked the media and was, I think, the first person in the White House to really do that. Kennedy having preceded Nixon and being a master manipulator of the media and its darling, if you will. And Nixon, of course, was quite the reverse, and because he was portrayed as something other than a hero himself, he attacked the media much as we're seeing the media being attacked now.
Right. So as we move forward, one of the old school journalists we talked about, you and I, just today, is Bob Schieffer. I happened to watch Face the Nation a couple of weeks ago, and I found a clip that I thought might be relevant to some of the things that we're talking about on Face the Nation. So hopefully technology will assist us, and we'll see this clip of Bob Schieffer on Face the Nation.
62% of people are now getting their news from social media, from Facebook. And while those are great vehicles, they don't exactly follow the same standards that we did in the mainstream media and still do. And that is, we don't print or broadcast something unless we check it out and find out if it's true. So there's all this news out there right now. You don't know who to believe. Is it true? Is it not true? And that's what we're sorting our way through right now.
Thoughts about that?
Well, I think there's a lot of truth to that, but I think there's another side of it also. And the other side is what I was just saying, that when you only have 3 units, essentially, that are the most reliable sources of news, that's probably too limiting. And my experience in Washington, one of the reasons I didn't stay in Washington and become a reporter there, is that there is such a symbiosis between the press corps and the politicians. That's obviously not the case with the Trump administration, but it's been true with every other administration. And it's true with some people in the Trump administration, because you keep hearing these stories that come out of the White House, and, you know, contradicting the president, saying that the staff within the White House is divided and so on and so forth. Well, that's because the reporters are so tight with those people and they are willing to speak to them. But notice they never mention, they never have to account for themselves, they never have to be called to account for the stories that they're putting out. So, you know, yes, of course, the standard is that we always try to check it out and find out what's true and what's not. But there are lots of different ways of judging the truth of any given thing. And it seems to me that it may be healthier, even though it's much more confusing, and that we're subject now, as you were suggesting, to fake news and things that get circulated and taken for granted or believed by people, even though they're not. It may be that ultimately to have multiple news sources is going to get you closer to reality than just having a single voice. When the networks were dominant, the 3 of them, they were a single voice. I mean, they were competing with one another. They thought they were, they said they were. But they were telling the same stories pretty much over and over again. And now you do see a much greater variety because there's so many different media that are involved. I don't know what the outcome of that is for journalism. And I think that those of you who are here that are going into journalism are going to have to be pioneers, just like Channel 2 was a pioneer in the age of television when we were using 35mm film. We had to wait around for it to be developed, and it was edited by cutting it up into little pieces, and we were always afraid the editor was going to cut the film and wreck it. And of course, then we segued into different media. But that's your challenge, is to figure out how to do journalism of the sort that Bob Schieffer would like to see, where we really do go out and find out what's true and what's not, by some kind of standard. First of all, you have to establish the standard. What is it? How do you know what's true and what's not? That's the first question you have to ask yourself. And then you have to determine, well, does this or does this not meet that standard, and how do I present it, given the nature of the medium that I'm working in. Now, people have to work in all different kinds of mediums. Anybody who's in the television has to also podcast, they have to, do Twitter, they have to tweet, they have to be on Facebook, they have to do all this different stuff. And I think, too, that they find, in fact, I know that when you work in a different medium, you tell a different story. And the medium, to a certain extent, determines what the story is going to be. So that's another element that complicates the equation of how you report or how you determine what's journalism and what's not. So I wish you well in that regard, because that's your job. That's what you have to do. That's what you have to figure out. I hope you get extra credit.
In this quest to find truth, let's say in a story, one of the tendencies we have today, I agree wholeheartedly, people need to take advantage of and examine multiple sources of information. However, the people who are on the left will watch NBC and they're preaching to the choir there. The people who are on the right are watching Fox, and they're hearing what they want to know. So how do you, there are multiple sources of information, but people go where they're most comfortable.
That's right.
And where there's an affirmation of what they already believe. Yeah. How do we get around that?
Well, I think that's a great question. And that, again, is part of the challenge. I don't know what you do about that. People are comfortable in hearing, people watch the news, I think, some of them watch the news to become informed. Some of them watch the news, and too many of them watch the news, I think, and examine yourself for the way you watch the news. And when I say watch, I mean in all the different forms that it can appear, including print. To what extent are you watching to see confirmed what you already believe? I think we all have to ask ourselves that question. I certainly do. And as a reporter, that's what I try to do. As people suggest, you check with as many sources as you possibly can to come up with what might be believable and what's not. And sometimes you don't know. Sometimes you're stuck with saying, well, there's this possibility and there's that possibility, and only God knows the real truth. But then you have to say so. You have to say, I can't come to a final conclusion about this because there's just no way to do it. But how do you get people who, as I say, simply want to confirm what they already believe? And those are the people who listen to the president and believe what he says and see it repeated on Breitbart and see it repeated on Fox and so on. Apparently, Fox, for example, did almost nothing on, or I forget how it works out in minutes. But by comparison to MSNBC and CNN, they did orders of magnitude less coverage of Puerto Rico than the others did. And so the people who watch those entities don't know as much about Puerto Rico. So when the president says, they've sort of screwed up down there in Puerto Rico as he did today, they probably believe it. And they don't recognize that he's taken an oath to protect all citizens of the United States, including those in Puerto Rico. How do you get people to change the channel? I don't know. And again, will we ever go back to the time when, as happened when I was growing up, and that's World War II and the immediate aftermath, everybody was pretty much looking at the same news. And we all could disagree about, in degrees about the news, but not necessarily about what the truth is, or what's real and what's false. We didn't have that challenge. Now you do. And if I had an easy answer to that one, I wouldn't be sitting here on this stage. I'd be trying to work it out.
I think a lot of people were drawn here tonight because of the topic of fake news and alternate facts. You mentioned this information that comes out of the White House, which they call leaks. And the president's like, we need to stop the leaks when they're leaking the information. The discrediting, first of all, of the news media, which is the only industry mentioned in the Constitution. What kind of danger might we be in right now in this era of discrediting what some would say is credible information?
Well, I think it's hugely dangerous. And I'm very, very concerned about it. Very concerned about the future of the country as a result. I think that to a certain extent, the president is the culmination of a long chain of events where the media got less and less credible as it became, ironically enough, as it became more diverse and as people could choose what they wanted to see that confirmed what they already believed. I think that the media, when they were speaking with a single voice, failed utterly, and I hold myself responsible as well as everybody else, to recognize the diversity of thought in the country, not just the diversity of the background and race and all that sort of thing, but that people think in different ways and for different reasons. And what, you know, all this stuff that comes out of Washington, where the news media are located and focused now, more intensely than ever before, particularly now that there are fewer of them, and you get this stuff out of Washington. And it's often said, and I think correctly, that you know, a lot of people on the coasts, where we all come from, who are in the news media, they don't know what's going on in West Virginia, and they don't know what's going on in Western Pennsylvania or Michigan or those other states that went for Trump. And I think that's the fault of the media. I think it's my fault. I covered political conventions that were in different places. I followed political candidates around. I had a wonderful time following Jesse Jackson around when he was running for president in 1988. And I went to a lot of different places. And consequently, I was able to report back on what was going on in those places. For example, I went to a place in Mississippi. And there was we went, because Jesse Jackson was there, I happened to be there, and I heard about this re-election campaign for the first African-American ever elected to Congress since, I think, Reconstruction, from Mississippi. I forgot his name. He ultimately became a cabinet member during the Clinton administration. But he was having an event in the wilds of Mississippi. And it was at some kind of bar and restaurant that was frequented by good old white boys. And we drove up there, and there were all these trucks with gun racks in the back, you know, and we went inside. It's a completely white audience. They loved this guy. And the reason they loved him was that he had managed to get the Pentagon to sign a contract to buy catfish for the troops. And they produced catfish in this congressional district in Mississippi. Well, that's a great story. I mean, who thought that, it had nothing to do with race if this guy was in the, and they didn't care about that. And somebody at some point said, who are you supporting for president? And everybody absolutely broke up because, of course, the truth was he was supporting Jesse Jackson. I don't know, I forget who was running at the time. It wasn't George Wallace, but if it was somebody like that, they'd have been supporting him. So it was really informative to me, and I think illustrative. In my case, it was pretty rare that I got that kind of exposure to a part of the country I didn't know at all. And I think we as a media, and I think particularly the networks, all of the resources that they've had from time to time, they did have for a while. CBS had a guy named Charles Carroll that would run around and do feature stories and in odd places, interesting places. But they were more done for purposes of humor and fun and so on than they were to say, these are your fellow citizens and this is how they operate. We failed to do that. And I think consequently, people in those areas got very turned off by the media. Then came the changes in the economy and the jobs moving away. And there's a wonderful book about the town where Paul Ryan comes from in Wisconsin, about what happened there when the jobs went away. And the General Motors plant closed down and so on and so forth. These people were really ticked off, but you didn't hear that on the news. You didn't know about that at the time. but they were getting angry. And pretty soon states like Wisconsin that it used to be very Republican were getting more and more Republican because they thought the Democrats must be responsible for this because the Democrats had been in charge for a long time. These divisions occurred and they weren't reported. And politicians didn't talk about it. It's their fault too. They didn't talk about it. They didn't talk about the people who were suffering as a result of the recession, for example. And a lot of people suffered a lot because of the recession. They didn't talk about it. Obama chose healthcare instead of dealing with the economy when he became president. That may have been a big mistake on his part. But I think what happened then was that the media became the target rather than the trusted source of information. Trump played it like a fiddle, and he had that sleazy television association because of his show, which nobody would admit watching, but of course lots of people did, and it made him a celebrity. Yes. And people were more willing to believe him than they were these politicians who they thought were lying to them.
Mm-hmm. As a consequence of so many of these things, that we're seeing a decentralization as far as the dissemination of news. Social media is certainly doing that. And so it begs the question, can journalism be effectively produced by anyone?
Well, that's a huge question. I don't know the answer to it. We're learning, for example, that one of the important elements of the last campaign having to do with the manipulation of social media was artificial intelligence, bots. And bots were putting ads on Twitter and on Facebook. They're trying to deny it, but they did. And apparently large numbers, and they focused on the states that turned for Trump. And the moment that this is according to a guy apparently at USC, I just heard this story on the radio a couple of days ago. Now I haven't had a chance to look at it in greater detail. When I'm podcasting, which I'm going to do soon, I hope I will. But apparently what this guy at USC found was that you followed those bots, the election was over, boom, they stopped. And they started doing something else. They went to France, and they started appearing there when they had an election there. And then they went to Germany when Merkel was running for re-election there. Well, when people see those, and ads are very powerful. Even when I was in television, and it's been a long time, studies would show that people knew as much from ads on television, particularly political ads, about the political system than they did from the news coverage. Another reason that it's easy to fool some of the people a lot of the time. And so artificial intelligence was responsible for finding the place where the ad would work and using it there. How do you counteract that? Does journalism have a responsibility to counteract that? It seems to me that in some sense it does, but until the audience is searching for the truth, I don't know how you do it. I don't know how you change it. It's a new world, a different world.
Well, one of the things, this transformation from the information age into the technology age, one of the things we have not been that good at is changing our educational system. To really focus more, for example, on visual images and how teaching people to really delve into and deconstruct visual images in the same way you would literature.
Yeah.
And we have not done a good job of doing that. I became not just a follower, but a teacher of media literacy some years ago. And it was so interesting to find out how many countries around the world are so much further ahead of us as far as visual literacy and media literacy is concerned. It's something that we have not focused on.
Well, it seems to me that given the realities of the communication system with the internet and artificial intelligence, all the rest of it, that every single school should be teaching media literacy from a very early time. And how do you recognize what's true and what's not? Sometimes, of course, it's very difficult. These things are very well produced and artfully crafted. But people better start recognizing that that's what they're looking at. And, not Uncle Walter.
Right. It's like the first rule of media literacy is all information is constructed. It's put together by someone.
Yeah.
And if you don't think about that and ask questions about that, then you really don't have any control over the information.
Yeah. Well, and had that been the case, even when I was a television reporter, I'd have been a better television reporter. Because the audience would have demanded it. You know, what's going on in Mississippi? What do I know? You know, my uncle came from there, or whatever. The audience needs to change. I think that maybe that's the most important answer to your question. And that, so we can't do it from the top down, as it were, or sideways, or however you want to do that.
It has to be demanded. Okay, it may be time, I'm sure the audience may have some questions here that will start some additional dialogue as well. And so I know we have two microphones, one on either side, one on the left there, and one on the right over there. So anyone who would like to ask a question, if you yes, there are people. If you'd like to make your way to one of the two microphones, if you'd like to ask a question. We'll do our best to have that answered. Yes, so you can start right there and start by identifying yourself.
Well, you know she has good judgment because she listens to my show all the time.
Okay. A little bit. We're hearing that.
The speaker seems to be here. So I guess they're not on the same system.
Can we try this microphone on this side, see if we do any good?
Testing, testing.
Much better.
Nobody's asking questions over here. Good, we got some discussion. Great.
If I could take my mic off and hand it to you, I would, but it's up to my...
All right, here we go.
Here is that.
You guys, this is an outstanding presentation. That Travis, KCRW 1954. So, my question, how do we get the truth if we don't watch 8 or 9 different shows? Because I teach a course at Santa Monica College called Current Events and World Affairs, and I try to do it with equity. I watch BBC, I watch Al Jazeera, I watch CNBC, I watch Fox News. Now, my question is, am I just an octogenarian who's lost it? I think Trump's on more television screens than any president I've seen in my octogenarian years on this planet. Could you answer that question?
I think that the media created Trump and created a campaign. I think most responsible of all was CNN, which I happen to have on in my office. I got to have something on to see what's going on, and they have more cameras in more places around the world than anybody else. But early on in his campaign, before anybody was taking it seriously at all, they were running uninterrupted Trump rallies without comment, without any really valuable news content whatsoever, because it was entertainment. And when I was in television, what I noticed and what happened, and the reason that I got out of it, was that television news began to cover politics as entertainment. And that's the classic example of it. And they, in my opinion, helped to create Trump. I forget the name of the president of CNN now. He's had to account for this to some extent. He's gotten called on it. But they would let him go on. And I'm talking 15, 20 minutes with an occasional apologetic break for a commercial. No commentary, no explanation of what he was doing there. No explanation of why he, as opposed to all of the other people who were running for president, was on there for 20 minutes. And I hope that's an answer to your question. The other question you asked essentially was look at different sources, and you're absolutely right. And under no circumstances should one ever be satisfied with watching a single or paying attention to a single source of news. You have to look around. That's part of media literacy.
Yeah, I think also you raise an important point also in terms of this intersection between what we call news and what we call entertainment.
That's right.
In 1976, the film Network really began to scratch the surface of that in terms of where we might go, and we're so far beyond that today. And the whole idea of, and Neil Postman wrote a book about it, entertaining ourselves to death. So it's, are we getting what we deserve is a question that we have to ask ourselves as far as the population is concerned. As far as this embrace of celebrity and this embrace of entertainment and allowing it to pass for news and information.
Yeah. To a certain extent, that began in Los Angeles. I won't go into it in any great length, but Happy Talk News. When I first got here, the anchor person was not allowed to ad-lib ever. It didn't know anything. It was an anchor person reading the news, and I was an anchor from time to time, and I knew I didn't know anything. Somebody else wrote it. That's one of the things I didn't like about it. But that changed, and pretty soon you've seen more and more ad-libbing and commentary going on, and people chattering away, and it even happens on places where it shouldn't, or where you wouldn't expect it, and they don't know what they're talking about. They just rattle on, and they think they're being entertaining. They're trying to hold you and keep you from turning the station and checking out somebody else. And you have to be very alert to that.
Thank you. Next.
Hello. Good evening. I'm from India, Dr. Manjuji. I'm a spiritual leader. I wanted to ask, what are the consequences of Las Vegas incidents? And how this insecurity would be overcome through media, by peace?
I'm sorry, I don't understand.
Yeah, I didn't quite get that.
Las Vegas incident of killing 50 people and 400 people injured. So, what will be the consequences of this, and how can this insecurity be overcome?
You're talking about the man who killed so many people in Las Vegas?
Yeah.
I don't know if there's any way to stop that. I've done programs about it and other incidents of its kind. And in this case, for example, it's quite typical. And evidently it's typical of mass murderers that they're not necessarily people that anybody would have expected doing anything like that before. And so there's no way of determining who might or might not do such a thing in advance. And of course, we're awash in guns. And we have as many guns in this country as we do people, if not more. And the availability of guns everywhere in California, even though we have laws that are supposed to limit guns in California, we still have millions and millions of them. And as long as we have the guns, we have ammunition. Anybody could do that at any time. It's a very frightening fact, but it is true. And why each one is worse than the last, I don't know. Apparently this person took a long time planning it, working it out. There was nobody do it. Nobody could have said, don't do it anymore, stop. It's a terrifying reality. It's a reality. On the other hand, fewer people died, and this is not to denigrate the deaths in any way, but fewer people died there than are dying in a lot of places around the world. Sometimes because they're being bombed by American planes and by nations that we have friendly relations with. So I suppose if you look at it in that sort of grimly realistic way, you can live with it, but it's very hard to live with it.
So what role can media play to improve the situation or bring peace?
I don't know. There are people who say, don't, and you should stand aside and let somebody else ask the question, I think. But there are people who say, don't do so much news coverage of the person who commits the act. And the answer to that is that might not allow, that might discourage copycats, although we don't know necessarily that people are copycats, partly because they often end up dead themselves. But there's an enormous amount of interest and curiosity, and when something like that happens, just try to tell people that we're not going to try to find out who this guy was or why he might have done that. It's very difficult to not do that. I think it is done in my opinion, in a somewhat sensationalistic way, and I think that the media are rightly criticized for that. But you can't look away.
Hi. Okay, now I know Mike. Over several decades, the station, the limitation on ownership laws of media has loosened over the last 40 years or so. I was wondering to what extent you think that has affected diversity, ownership, news reporting, because in middle America, a lot of places they get the media from social media, news from one station or social media.
I think that's a very good question, and as I understand, it's going to get a lot worse because the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, is going to allow a single entity to own 90 more stations than ever been the case before. When I was working for a while, I was the Washington bureau chief for the CBS-owned stations, and they could only have 5 stations. There was New York, Chicago, Philadelphia, St. Louis, and Los Angeles. And that was because there was a thought that no entity, certainly not a network like that, should own so many stations that it has a dominant voice. But now, I'm trying to think of the name of their, is it Sterling? Sinclair, thank you. Sinclair is going to be allowed to own a vast number of stations. And this is an organization that, in fact, sends to its stations pre-produced commentaries. Turns out they're very right-wing commentaries. It would be just as bad if they were left-wing commentaries. And people all over the country are going to see those same commentaries without any sort of contrary voice. There used to be rules in the old days when I first started out. There was what was called the fairness doctrine, and if somebody was attacked on your newscast, you were supposed to give them an opportunity to respond. If there was a position that was taken that was at one extreme, you had to provide the other extreme. You had to give people the opportunity to respond. That went away, and the reason it went away, the argument for it was that now we have all these different entities that are putting out information, and there will be enough that it'll happen automatically. Of course, it doesn't, and it particularly won't. As Sinclair owns, I forget what the number of big markets. They're going to be in Los Angeles. They're going to have Channel 5 in Los Angeles, a major station in the country. They're going to have big stations in Chicago and New York. And, it's a very dangerous development.
Right. It happened in radio, and one of the dangers is, there's a company called Clear Channel. They changed their name now, but in the Los Angeles market, Clear Channel owned 8 different radio stations. They all had different formats, and as you move from station to station, you thought you were listening to 8 different voices when you were listening to the same voice. So this whole idea of sampling and making sure that you look at diverse, sources of information, that was defeated by the fact that it was the same guy that you didn't even know it was the same guy. And so there's a real danger,
that's right.
a tremendous danger in that. But it's getting larger and larger. And it's not just the problem in our country, it's global. There are pretty much about 6 companies that control the majority of all information that goes all around the world. All of these gigantic companies. And the move is going more and more toward, relaxation of the rules that protect people. And so, in terms of what can we do about it, we have to be engaged, we have to be active, we have to have our voices heard. And the more we sit back and become just consumers of information in terms of actively participating, it just increases the danger that we're in. One would hope that Channel 5, for example, if they start
operating the way that other stations of Sinclair have operated, there ought to be a protest. They really should, and people ought to demand that their rights are being violated by the fact that they're only being given one point of view. Of course, they'll say, of course, there are stations who want to watch it. But I would hope that civic organization could occur around that, and that would become an issue.
Thank you. Hi, I've lived and worked in 3 different countries as a journalist, and I can tell you that these sorts of mass shootings don't happen elsewhere. Occasionally when they do, things are done. But there's a culture here and that has specialized in stopping things from getting done when we have a tragedy like we had in just recently. One more thing, I wonder what you'd have to say about the homogenization of local news, local television news, which is, you go to basically any major city in the United States and the newscasts look and sound the same. Usually start with a fire somewhere, with a soundtrack. And how does that affect the public's information and awareness of things?
Well, I think it narrows it terribly, and as I said, there's been this effort to entertain. This is kind of a funny example of it. When I've worked for all the network stations here in town one time or another, and when I was at Channel 7, there was an incident where there was a massive rainstorm. Occasionally we're subject to these downpours in this city, and cars wash down streets and that sort of thing. It hasn't happened here for a while, but it will. And there was on a hill near the Pacific Coast Highway in Orange County, there was an enormous rock the size of a car way up on top of this hill. And geologists were called in to say, is that rock going to give way? And they said, yeah, it is. And below it, on the Pacific Coast Highway, was a row of houses. So they vacated the houses, and the word got out. And every television station in town had somebody down there with a camera pointed at that rock. And the promise was, when that goes, we're going to be there and you're going to see it live. So this went on and on and on. And I had prepared a long and very thoughtful piece on Tom Bradley's re-election campaign. He had just announced, and this was a thoughtful piece of work. It took me a long time. And it was supposed to run on that newscast that night. And I'm waiting for it to run, and they kept going back and saying, it hasn't moved yet, but boy, when it moves, we're gonna show you. And they kept finding people to come out and talk about it, wow, that's a big rock up there. And every station was doing exactly the same thing. So you can figure there's 7 stations in town, everybody had a camera down there, they were all doing the same thing. And it went on for I think it went on into another newscast. So we're talking an hour and 10 minutes or something like that, of what's supposed to be news devoted to a rock that's sitting up on top of a hill. So all of a sudden we're looking at the monitor and the rock breaks loose. And it comes bouncing down the hill, disappears behind the houses, and bursts out of the front of one of the houses. Boards and plaster and stuff are flying all over the place. And it bounces across the road and goes into the sea. And simultaneously, or not quite, but almost, we all realized we were the only station that was on live. Oh. And the voice of our news director came over the intercom saying, God wants eyewitness news to be #1. So all that news time, if you added up the news time that was devoted to that rock, we all know that gravity functions, and it was going to come down. We could have showed it on tape quite easily, and you would have seen exactly the same picture. But we had to have it live. When that kind of thinking exists in the news, you're lost, And that's why CNN did Donald Trump for 20 minutes at a time. because they thought they could hold the audience. Everything is about attention. And getting the attention because you've got the commercial. You sell the time. And that's just the way it works.
Yeah, and unfortunately, usually it gets us focused on things that are terrible things that we're waiting to happen.
Yeah.
It reminds me again of OJ and the Bronco. There's nowhere you could go where people are just not watching this Bronco on the freeway, driving for all of this amount of time, in anticipation of something terrible happening. What does that say about us?
Well, and the car chases they don't do the car chases as often as they used to. But there was a time when every car chase, everybody's got a helicopter up there, and they got to amortize the cost of the helicopter, and so they were doing car chases, and the police would be chasing some car, and the anchor people would be talking about, what kind of car it was. And let's see, that's a 47 or 57 Pontiac or something. It's an old car, but the guy must have souped it up, They have no idea what they're talking about.
Let's get to a few more questions, and because before we wrap it up, I want the audience to find out what your plans are next. So that's the come. Yes?
Hi, I'm Terry Green, a math professor from SMC. And my problem is I can't talk to friends and relatives anymore because they've got a different source of information, Fox News, Breitbart, whatever. I'm listening to CNN, MSNBC, reading the LA Times. How is it going to be that we're going to be in the future be able to talk to one another with so many different sources of information?
Well, that's your problem. I don't know the answer. I remember when my father was a Republican because of the Democrats, but my family was Republican, and when my sister's fiance announced that he was a Democrat, my grandmother dropped her knitting. People are going to disagree.
Hi, I'm Leia. I'm a student at SMC, and my question for you is, in the documentary you were saying, I really want to learn and everything, and I was wondering, how do you really listen to a person? Like, I think that my generation in particular, it's so hard to actually listen to people, and I think that I love your program so much because I can tell that you really listen to your informants.
I want to know why the hell they think those things. I find it really interesting to get people to explain to me how they arrived at whatever decision it was that they arrived at. Do they have a scientific, factual basis for it? Are they operating on instinct? I try to question them and learn for myself how they've arrived at what I find to be an interesting conclusion, a challenging conclusion, an important conclusion, whatever it is. I'm just really interested in people, and I have the fortune too of having more than one person on, and so sometimes I can go to the next person and say, well, what do you think? Because they're perhaps more knowledgeable than I am, but have arrived at different conclusions. So I can play them off against one another, and that's a sort of journalistic thing to do. The danger of it is false equality, false comparison, and to give them equal weight if in fact they don't have equal weight. So, for example, I don't have any climate deniers on anymore. I don't think it's a reasonable position, and yet we have a president who's a climate denier. So it's become very difficult to deal with issues of that kind. And when you have the leader of the free world lying openly and clearly, and we can say that without fear of contradiction, because it's been pretty well demonstrated that he does.
It raises a special question. I try to stay away from that kind of thing because I don't know what to do with it.
thank you both for participating in this program. First of all, this summer I taught at Beijing and watched an English language television network, China Global Television Network, that seemed to cover, in my opinion, the news more effectively than our American networks. And also, I thought that international news coverage was particularly thorough in the China network. And I don't see as much international news coverage on some of the networks here. Secondly, I wonder, the network there seemed to have a large demarcation line between commentary and straight news. And I don't find that as often here in the United States, where it seems as if many of the commentators are expressing bias rather than reporting news more accurately and more impartially. And I wonder what can be done about increasing international news on the one hand, and also, if possible, making a clear demarcation line between commentary and straight news coverage and less bias in the media. Can that be done?
That's a really good, really interesting point. The failure to cover international news is sort of the nature of the country. I mean, we've been protected by the oceans where we were for so long. We didn't have to worry about what was going on anyplace else. And, until Pearl Harbor, never thought that we were ever in any danger. And we still, obviously, are one of the safest places in the country in terms of the possibility of being invaded. And consequently, there's just not that much interest. It's odd, in my opinion, because we're now so diverse a nation. And so one of the reasons that, what happened to me, I started doing Which Way LA after the riots, and the idea was to find out what was happening in Los Angeles. And after a certain amount of time, we realized that international news and national news are local news in Los Angeles because everybody's here. And so we started doing more of those kinds of stories. Why that isn't the case with the national networks, I don't really know. I think it probably has more to do with the advertisers than anything else, because they are so dominant. You would know this, given your experience in the executive.
That's a really good point in terms of the role that the advertisers do play. I've become a fan of watching Vice News, but you have to have HBO, but there are no commercials. But they cover stories from all around the globe that you rarely see on our regular network television broadcasts.
And I think public radio does more of it too than sort of the other radio news sources. Excuse me.
We're just about out of time, unfortunately, and I'm being given the wrap-up sign. But one of the things that I do want to acknowledge is, again, we have a number of students out here today, and just if you could give some last words to them in terms of what their role can be and what they might expect and how they need to be prepared as far as the future world of journalism is concerned.
Well, I would say that you are in a very exciting moment because there is so much change in the media, and because veterans, old guys such as myself, can't possibly predict what's going to happen or what kinds of challenges you're going to face. And you're going to have to really be on your toes. There's all these different media that you're going to have to learn and deal with to begin with. How do you communicate? How do you work them? How do you handle them? I'm still fumbling around with them myself, and I'm not adept in the way that you are and will need to be as time goes on. But you are in a position to shape the kinds of experience that people have, the knowledge they have about their country, their politics, their government, and figure out how to use these media in such a way that we can have a better informed citizenry, and we can try to deal with civil rights, and we can try to amend relations with other countries, and be a world leader in the way that we've thought of ourselves in the past, or whether that was accurate or not. But you have a great challenge ahead, and in a certain sense I envy you, I really do. I'd love to start where you are and get going and be next. And I wish I could live long enough to see how it turns out, but I wish you luck. I love you, and I hope you do very well. And good luck. I'm going to stop doing my radio program. I have mixed feelings about that, but the program's not going to be here anymore, but I am going to podcast. And I'm looking forward to podcasting. It's a very different medium. It's much less formal. It's very intimate. You have to approach it in a different way because people can't just turn on the channel and find you, or and there you are. You have to seek you out. You have to give some reason to do that. You know, why is my podcast going to be more interesting than somebody else's podcast? And this is exciting to me in the same way that establishing what the new journalism is going to be is exciting to you because podcasting is a totally different medium, and yet more and more people are getting more and more of their news information from podcasts. So how do you do that? What's the most effective way to do it? It's not live like my program. Being live has certain limitations. You're bound by the clock, which can be very frustrating. I have to say, I'm sorry. I can't explore that fascinating subject with you. I'd love to do it, but we're running out of time. Well, on a podcast, you can say, no kidding, really? Is that what you mean? And you can go on as long as you want to. I'm really looking forward to that aspect of it. It'll be interesting to see to learn how to draw an audience to a program such as the kind that I intend to do and want to do. The 24/7 news cycle, which I've now become a part of, and news in general takes up all your time. And so this is an opportunity for me to reflect on what some of the issues behind the news are about. What I hope is to be able to establish programs that have shelf life so that people will want to come back and listen to them in the future. And because they're about something more than what the president said today or the latest disaster or whatever it is. It's something, meatier and more involved. So I'm looking forward to it very much. And I'll do it at least once a week and hopefully more often because I like to work a lot.
So thank you so much for coming out. Thank you to the associates. I'd like to acknowledge that our president, Dr. Catfish Jeffries, did make it here in person. I'd like to appreciate and thank you all so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
And thank you to our owners.
Thank you, gentlemen of the college. Thank you for your service.
Thank you again, Warren Olney and John Dawson. Yes, earlier tonight you were given a membership application. If you feel inspired, please fill it out and bring it to one of the tables located in the lobby. If you've misplaced your membership application, the people at the staff tables